Throughout North Carolina, his story is still spoken in low tones. Lazarus was a slave who planned his retaliation so carefully that in one night, 9 plantation managers were burned alive. One fire, 9 men, and no survivors. This was neither an impulsive act of fury or a crime of passion. This was done with the methodical, purposeful precision of a master craftsman who knew exactly how to transform the very industry that had enslaved him into a tool of death. But why would a man seek such deliberate retribution? What did the 9 supervisors do to Lazarus that the only appropriate punishment that could be applied was to burn them alive? And how could a single helpless slave without freedom or weapons organize and carry out the flawless killing of 9 white men without leaving any trace? I need you to do something before we discover how Lazarus turned fire and turpentine into vengeance. Hit the subscribe button now and leave a comment with your location, state, and city. If you find stories of planned retaliation fascinating, let's now find out what transpired in Cumberland County's pine trees in 1856, and how the killing of one man led to the execution of 9 more. In 1856, southeastern North Carolina's pine forest covered hundreds of miles. A sea of longleaf pine had turned the area into America's turpentine capital. More naval stocks, turpentine, tar, and rosin were produced in Cumberland County, the setting for our story, than in any other county in the country. Enslaved labor was used almost exclusively in this cruel, backbreaking industry. As opposed to tobacco or cotton, there were turpentine camps deep in the trees, sometimes 20 or 30 meters from society, and plantations where slaves would work close to the main home. These camps created remote kingdoms where overseers had absolute power. Turpentine extraction was a risky and taxing procedure. In order to create a V-shaped wound known as a box close to the base of the trunk, enslaved laborers known as turpentine hands would make deep diagonal cuts in the pine trees. Workers would use long-handled dippers to scoop out the resin after it had gradually soaked into these boxes and accumulated there. Every few days, the cuts had to be replaced, and they continued to rise higher and higher up the tree all season long. One employee may be in charge of thousands of trees, walking miles every day through underbrush teeming with snakes and inhaling the heady, pleasant smell of pine resin that covered their skin and lungs. However, neither the workers nor the plantation owners who benefited from their labor made the actual money in turpentine. A system had developed in Cumberland County. On the periphery of the formal business was a shadow economy. Here's where our story really starts. Lazarus was a member of a medium-sized plantation along the Cape Fear River, was owned by a guy named Cyrus Hartwell. Like many other owners in the area, Hartwell had found that renting out slave labor to the turpentine industry was a more lucrative venture than cultivating land. While the turpentine operation provided food and housing for the worker, he could hire out a man like Lazarus for $8 to $10 a month, paid straight to him. A strange dynamic was produced by the system. White overseers and managers who functioned with little to no supervision in the isolated forest camps were in charge of the enslaved people, who seldom saw their legitimate owners. In 1856, Lazarus was 32 years old, but neither he nor anyone else knew how old he was. Born on the Hartwell farm, he was the son of Ruth, who passed away when he was 7 years old. All he had known as a child was the turpentine woodlands. He began assisting to gather resin as a young boy, and eventually became a full-time employee by the age of 12. He was considered a premier hand by the time he was in his early 30s, someone who understood the forest better than anyone, could handle the most trees, and could tell by looking at a cut whether it would run dry or produce good resin. Tall and slender from years of hard work, he was a quiet man whose hands were permanently discolored amber by the sticky resin that never completely went away. Later, recollections of him would describe his dark, watchful eyes, which were constantly calculating and observing. He had learned to read on his own, using abandoned newspapers to pass the time when he could, and deciphering words in the workers' cabins by using the firelight. He concealed this ability from his supervisors, but it would eventually be essential to his strategy. Vernon Ketchum oversaw the turpentine operation where Lazarus was employed. However, 9 supervisors who oversaw various areas of the enormous forest enterprise had the true power. These men themselves did not own plantations. They were overseers, poor white people who had fought their way up to positions of power over slave labor. Later, the official death records would include their names: Thomas Garraway, Samuel Pewitt, Silas Farrow, Bogart Vincent, Nathaniel Boggs, Elias Crenshaw, Josiah Talbot, and Abner Little. They were each in charge of 20 to 40 slaves, employees in various pine forest regions, and each had established a reputation for brutality of his own. Puett was well known for his whip, which he carried coiled like a snake at his belt. By threatening to sell workers' children if they didn't reach quotas, Stokes favored psychological torture. Although the enslaved workers never received any wages from which these fines could be subtracted, Boggs had a system of fines for fictitious violations. Instead, the penalties were taken in the form of physical torture, reduced food, or more work. None of the plantation owners who leased out their human chattel, Vernon Ketchum, or even the other white laborers in the reason for the turpentine operation was that these 9 supervisors had established a separate private company inside the bigger company. Like many tales of injustice, it started with a woman. Dina was her name, and she had been married to Lazarus for 3 years. They had tied the knot in the manner that slaves might, without a ceremony or any legal acknowledgement, but with a relationship as genuine as any that was sanctioned by the state or church. Dinina prepared the modest supplies of cornmeal, salt pork, and molasses that made up the turpentine workers' daily meals in the cooking hut that catered to them. Her quick laugh could brighten even the gloomiest days in the forest camps, and she was 26. And she was expecting their first child at 6 months. When Lazarus went to the workers' compound on a Thursday night in March 1855, more than a year before the fire, he discovered Dinah gone from the cooking shack. The other females there refused to look him in the eye. An hour before sunset, an older woman named Hattie finally drew him aside and whispered that Dinah had been taken to his cabin by Silas Farrow. The slaves were not allowed in the supervisors' cabins. A quarter of a mile away from the workers' quarters is a group of rustic-hewn buildings. As the last of the light was fading from the sky, Lazarus walked toward Farrow's cabin, his heart thumping his ribs. Inside he heard voices, Farrow's inebriated laughing and the diner's high, terrified voice. The rumors that filtered across the enslaved population later debated what transpired next. Lazarus kicked in the door, according to some. According to others, he tried the handle and discovered it was unlocked. But what he observed was universally accepted. With his belt undone, Farrow strode toward Dinina, who was pressed against the wall with her ripped dress. Lazarus took 3 steps across the room and slapped Farrow across the face. The supervisor's own table splintered under his weight after he lost his balance due to intoxication. There was only the ragged breathing of Farrow and the distant chirping of crickets in the evening. Then Farrow got to his feet grinning, blood dripping from his nostrils. The words, "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, boy," were spoken in a low voice. Grabbing Dina's hand, Lazarus dragged her out of the cabin, knowing that there was nowhere to go and that fleeing would not fix anything. They fled through the darkening woodland out of instinct. They reached their own cabin before being overtaken by 6 white men. Among them was the Pharaoh, his face dark and swollen with anger. The entire workforce was supposed to learn a lesson from what transpired next. Together, the 9 supervisors assembled the enslaved laborers in a torched clearing. As the others looked on, Samuel Puett used his renowned whip to administer 40 lashes to Lazarus, who was bound to a whipping post that had been set up for this purpose. It wasn't as bad as that, though. Jedediah Stokes made the announcement as Lazarus was sliced down, barely conscious. Stokes said, "This one's shown himself to be uppity." His voice, Dinah screamed, "Too dangerous to keep here. Mr. Hartwell will be notified that we're selling him south come morning and his woman, too." Being sold south meant working enslaved people to death on sugar and cotton plantations in the deep south, where life expectancy was measured in years rather than decades, and even though she was pregnant, the trip alone could kill her. However, Abner Liddell, the youngest of the supervisors, held up his hand. "Now hold on," he said, a sarcastic smile on his lips. "I got a better idea. Not many workers want to go to the Lumber River, which is hard country, so Vernon has been wanting to expand the operation westward. How about we keep the woman here and let her pay off his debt?" he asked. "We need cooks, don't we? But this one..." He jerked his thumb at Lazarus and went west by himself, knowing that his woman and child were here because of his good behavior. Even if he stepped out of line once, she pays for it. The 9 supervisors nodded and conferred for a short time before agreeing. Lazarus would work the most isolated and hazardous part of the turpentine operation, 40 miles west in the swampy bottomlands near the Lumber River, where the trees grew in standing water and cottonmouth snakes dangled from branches overhead. If he caused any trouble, if he didn't meet his quota, If he even hinted at disobedience, word would be sent back and Diner would be punished. As the crowd was dismissed and Lazarus was being dragged to a wagon for transport, Thomas Garraway leaned close to his ear and whispered, "You should have just let Silas have his fun. Would have ended in 5 minutes. You can now live your entire life worrying about her safety. Are you unsure if your child will ever know who its father is? Boy, was it worth it." The wagon took him west and Lazarus remained silent, his back burning and his wrists bloodied from the ropes, but his eyes were clear as he gazed at each of the 9 men in turn, memorizing their features for reasons he did not yet understand. He didn't see Dina again for 3 weeks after that night. When he was finally permitted to visit her briefly with 2 armed guards, he discovered her thinner and her eyes hollow with fear and exhaustion. She spoke quickly in the few minutes they had together, telling him that she had been made to work 16-hour days in the cooking shack, that the supervisors had reduced the rations for all the women as a form of collective punishment, and that Silas Farrow had passed her several times a day to remind her that he could take anything he wanted, whenever he wanted. "But the baby?" Lazarus inquired, his hand shaking as it hovered over her swollen belly. "Still strong," she whispered. There, in the swamplands near the Lumber River, Lazarus worked in conditions that would have broken most men. The operation was smaller, more primitive, with only about 15 enslaved workers and 2 white overseers. The pines grew differently, twisted and stunted by the wet soil, creating less resin and requiring more cuts to produce the same amount. "It knows its daddy is fighting for us." That was the last time he spoke to her alive. Often knee-deep, the trees served as breeding grounds for snakes and mosquitoes, and workers suffered from fevers, infections, and other mysterious illnesses that left them too weak to fulfill their quotas. However, Lazarus discovered in that swamp that turpentine vapors, which were always present in the forest air, concentrated particularly in enclosed spaces, settling in low places, odorless and invisible until someone brought a flame near them. One afternoon, he witnessed a storage shed explode when an overseer lit his pipe too close to an open barrel. He discovered that the resin itself, once heated, turned into a fuel that water could not put out. He saw workers attempt to put out a small fire in a collection vat, only to see the water spread the burning resin across the ground like liquid hellfire. He discovered that the smoke from burning pine resin was thick and black, choking, capable of suffocating a man before the flames ever touched him, and he heard the flash of ignition and the roar of flames devouring everything in seconds. 3 months into his exile in the swamps, a new worker named Isaiah arrived, a young man transferred from the main operation, and he brought news from the camp where Danina worked. The news was devastating. Diner had lost the baby. Isaiah explained what had happened in whispers during the few evening hours when the workers were left unattended. Danina had been forced to, Isaiah said. They didn't even let her rest. She had pleaded with Hosea Talbert, the supervisor on duty, that she needed help lifting a heavy iron pot of boiling water, despite being far along in her pregnancy. Talbert had responded by threatening to withhold her rations if she didn't comply. She had lifted the pot, felt something tear inside her, and collapsed. The baby, a boy, was still born 2 days later, as he stood knee-deep in swamp water with the evening sun turning the sky orange through the pine branches overhead. Lazarus heard the news in silence. He said, "Had her back in the cooking shack. She was faking her grief to get out of work." Something changed in him in that moment. Not a breaking, but a hardening. A transformation of grief into something colder and more purposeful. He asked Isaiah a question. "Do the 9 supervisors who run the main operation still meet regularly?" Lazarus said nothing more, but he started to plan. Over the next few months, Lazarus became a model worker, exceeding his quotas, never complaining, and showing nothing but difference to the overseers in the swamp. Isaiah nodded. Every month on the first Friday, they all get together at old Pharaoh's cabin. They say they play poker there, and sometimes they stay until almost dawn. In November 1855, 8 months after the death of his son, Lazarus was returned to the main operation, citing his good behavior as justification for his return to less harsh conditions. He was granted small privileges, such as an extra biscuit with dinner and permission to stay up an hour later than the other workers to mend his tools. He used these moments of relative freedom to continue his covert education, finding old newspapers that the overseers had discarded and studying not just the words, but also the way white men conducted their business, the language they used, and the methods they employed. When he returned to the compound, he discovered that the diner had been sold, this time to a plantation owner in South Carolina, 3 weeks prior, though no one knew the exact location. The supervisors had determined that she was too depressed and sluggish in her work since losing the child, so they sold her for $75 and kept the money for themselves, telling Cyrus Hartwell that she had fled. The real reason was that they were short-staffed at the main camp, and bodies were needed for the winter tapping season. This was the last piece of information Lazarus needed. And if the 9 supervisors were so bold as to sell an enslaved person and keep the money for themselves, what other schemes might they be running? Lazarus started to watch and listen with renewed purpose. The turpentine operation, which Lazarus gradually learned was a masterwork of systematic theft, was a scheme that the supervisors had spent years perfecting. They were in charge of measuring and documenting the quantity of turpentine, tear and rosin that their respective forest sections produced, and they were supposed to accurately report these measurements to Vernon Ketchum, who then reported to the plantation owners. However, the supervisors had devised a system of false accounting that skimmed profits at every level, and Lazarus pieced this together by taking great risks and paying close attention. He learned to read the supervisors' ledgers, stealing moments when a book was left unattended, memorizing numbers and comparing them to the actual production he observed. A wagon would arrive at night once every few months, and these hidden stores would be loaded and taken away, sold to buyers in Wilmington or Fayetteville who asked no questions about provenance, and the money was divided among the 9 supervisors, each receiving an equal share of what amounted to hundreds of dollars per year. Supervisors underreported production by about 15%, not enough to raise immediate suspicion, but enough to accumulate significant quantities of unreported naval stores over time. A fortune for men of their station. But more valuable than the theft itself, Lazarus found the place where they kept their records. The group's bookkeeper, Silas Farrow, the same man who had attacked Diner, had a ledger in his cabin, hidden under a loose floorboard, that documented every transaction, theft, and dollar split among the 9 conspirators. The ledger covered 7 years, providing a comprehensive record of their criminal enterprise. Lazarus only saw this ledger once when Farrow had left his cabin unlocked while intoxicated, and he had sneaked in, found a hiding place, memorized as much as he could, and left without disturbing anything. Lazarus realized that this ledger was the supervisor's insurance policy, and their biggest weakness. They kept it as a safeguard against one another, evidence of their shared guilt that prevented any one of them from betraying the others, but it was also evidence that could destroy them all if it ended up in the wrong hands. The word of an enslaved man against 9 white supervisors would mean nothing in any court, legal or otherwise, and even if the plantation owners believed him, the supervisors would probably face fines or dismissal at worst, and Lazarus would be sold or killed for his trouble. Lazarus realized that simple revelation of the theft would not bring him justice, and that any retribution he sought would have to be absolute and untraceable. In January 1856, he started to formulate his plan. The monthly meetings of the 9 supervisors followed a predictable pattern, meeting at Silas. The meetings usually took place from sundown until well past midnight, sometimes until dawn, and took place in Farrow's cabin on the first Friday of every month, supposedly to play cards and drink. The cabin was the largest and most remote, located almost a mile from the closest worker quarters and surrounded by dense pine forest on all sides. They would divide their illicit profits, plan the next month's thefts, and celebrate their success with corn whiskey that Hosea Talbot brought from his brothers. Nevertheless, Lazarus discovered these facts through close observation and by cultivating sources. They get awfully drunk at those meetings. Among the other enslaved workers, an older man named Silas, who was not the same as Supervisor Farrow, served as a sort of servant to the supervisors, bringing them firewood, cleaning their cabins, and other duties that gave him access to their spaces and conversations. Silas trusted Lazarus, had known him since he was a boy, and shared what he saw without fully understanding why Lazarus was so interested. Silas mentioned one evening last month, when 3 of them passed out right there in Farrow's cabin. They didn't get home until almost dawn, and they always locked the door from the inside. They say that they don't want anyone to interrupt their card game, so they have all the windows closed tightly to prevent light from peeping through the forest. 9 inebriated men are secluded in a cabin surrounded by pine forest with turpentine operations. Lazarus knew that timing would be crucial, and that the first Friday of February was too early. He needed more time to prepare. March was feasible, but the heavy rains in March could throw his plan off. April was too late, and by April something might change. February would have to work. He would need less than a month to prepare. He needed 3 essential components for his plan: access to concentrated turpentine, a way to deliver it, and an alibi that would place him far from Pharaoh's cabin when the fire broke out. Lazarus had an advantage for the turpentine because he was a premier. Over the course of 3 weeks, Lazarus started transferring slightly less than required, concealing the excess in small jars that he buried at various locations in the forest. A few ounces here, a few ounces there, never enough to be used. On the one hand, he was trusted with some of the operation's more technical tasks, such as the distillation process that separated crude gum turpentine into spirits of turpentine and rosin. The spirits, pure, highly volatile turpentine, were normally stored in sealed barrels under close supervision. The delivery method was more complicated. He couldn't just pour turpentine around the cabin and light it, as that would be instantly identified as arson. The fire had to look accidental. The sort of tragedy that happened occasionally in turpentine operations where flammable materials were always present, and it had to start from inside the cabin to catch the 9 men off guard, so it could spread more quickly than they could react. Lazarus's forbidden literacy became important at this point. He had once read in a discarded newspaper about a method used by Confederate saboteurs in the early days of tensions between North and South, which involved delayed ignition devices using different chemical combinations. The article was vague, intended more to warn readers about enemy tactics than to give instructions, but it mentioned something about phosphorus and sulfur mixtures that could be triggered by air exposure. Lazarus didn't have access to phosphorus, but he was aware that matches, which were a relatively new invention in 1856, contained white phosphorus in their heads, and that certain chemical reactions could produce heat gradually over time, created delayed ignition by carefully controlling how air reached flammable materials. He conducted covert experiments with small amounts of materials, concealing his tests in isolated areas of the forest where no one went. He found that turpentine-soaked rags, if sealed in a container with a slow air leak, would eventually reach a temperature where spontaneous combustion could occur, especially if combined with specific chemical accelerants he could extract from the materials he was working with, such as sulfur from matches, linseed oil from barrel treatments, and even some types of tree sap that contained volatile compost ions. He was unable to predict the exact timing, but he was able to create conditions where ignition would occur anywhere between 3 and 8 hours after the materials were set. Lazarus needed to be visible and accounted for far from Pharaoh's cabin at the time of the fire, so he volunteered for a task he usually avoided: night watch at one of the collection points, which required a worker to stay awake through the night, protecting barrels of processed turpentine from thieves or animals. The collection point he volunteered for was 3 miles east of Pharaoh's cabin, and the overseer in charge was known to check on the night watchman several times to make sure he wasn't sleeping. The solution came from an unexpected source: Silas, the older enslaved man who worked for the supervisors in late January, casually mentioned that Pharaoh had asked him to bring extra firewood to the cabin before the February meeting, saying they want a good fire going. It would be the ideal alibi, but there was still one huge problem: how to get his incendiary materials into Pharaoh's cabin without being seen, and how to position them where they would be most effective. No one would question firewood in a cabin during the winter. That's a lot of work for one man, Lazarus explained carefully. You want help carrying it? Silas looked relieved. Keep the chill off while they play cards. Once a whole cord of wood stacked inside the cabin ready to feed the fire all night. Lazarus felt his pulse quicken. My back isn't as good as it used to be, and Pharaoh wants everything finished the day before the meeting and neatly stacked by his fireplace. So, it was decided that Lazarus and Silas would deliver firewood to Pharaoh's cabin on Thursday, February 5th, 1856, so they would have a valid reason to be there, legitimate access, and a chance to place the materials precisely where Lazarus needed them. The day before the wood delivery, Lazarus took out his concealed jars of turpentine and meticulously set up his ignition device. He had shaped himself and fired in one of the operation's kilns using a small clay pot, saying he was making a cooking vessel, and he made a sealed container with a small, barely perceptible hole in the lid, and inside he put rags soaked in turpentine and linseed oil mixed with sulfur from match heads. and some reactive tree resins he had discovered through his experiments, the mixture of which was supposed to heat slowly, as air slowly entered through the small hole, reaching ignition temperature several hours after being sealed. He made 3 of these pots, hedging his bets, thinking that if one didn't work, maybe another would. When Lazarus and Silas loaded a wagon with split firewood and drove it to Pharaoh's cabin on Thursday afternoon, the supervisor was there, watching impatiently as they unloaded the wood and stacked it beside the large stone fireplace that dominated one wall of the cabin, which was built roughly but spacious, with a heavy wooden table in the center where the supervisors would play cards, a few chairs scattered around, and shelves holding bottles of whiskey and other supplies. "Stack it neat," Pharaoh yelled. Lazarus arranged his 3 clay pots among the logs with care while they worked. "I don't want no mess tomorrow night. This is an important meeting." One ended up jammed between 2 logs near the fireplace near the bottom of the stack. He positioned another one behind the stack, tucked down against the wall out of sight. He placed the third in a hole in the stack, about 3 feet above the ground, so that when the stack was finished, it would be encircled by wood on all sides. The location was vital. As they heated, the pots closest to the bottom would light first, albeit the fire would start out tiny and manageable. A second wave of intense heat would be produced when the pot higher in the stack ignited later, after the fire had already been established. And they were all set up to start a fire that would quickly spread through the cabin's dry wood, wooden walls, floor, and anything else that may catch fire. Lazarus, however, wanted to add one more thing. He had found in his experiments that turpentine vapor was heavier than air. If left in an enclosed area, they would settle in low areas. The ensuing explosion would be disastrous if he could guarantee vapor buildup prior to ignition. When they were done stacking the wood, Lazarus dropped a few logs while feigning to trip. He had concealed 2 sealed turpentine containers amid the logs, and in the commotion of scooping them up, he punctured them with a little knife. Slowly the liquid started to leak out, soak into the nearby wood, start to evaporate, and eventually fall to the ground. There was a slight odor, and the cabin where it wouldn't raise suspicion because turpentine-related materials were frequently stored. "You clumsy fool," yelled Pharaoh. They finished swiftly and departed, saying, "Get that wood stacked right and get out. You seem nervous." "Something wrong?" "Just tired," Lazarus said as they pushed the wagon away. Lazarus hardly slept that night. This work wears a man down. He went over the entire plan in his head, including every potential point of failure. What if there was no fire from the pots? What if they caught fire before the supervisors got there? What if they were found out before to the meeting? What if the men managed to flee before the fire started? However, it was too late to make any changes in the morning. They started the mechanism. February 6, 1856, Friday. Cold and clear it dawned. Lazarus arrived at his designated area of the forest to begin his daily task of tapping trees. He counted down the hours until evening while working mechanically and distractedly. In order to start his night watch duty at the collection point 3 miles east of Pharaoh's cabin, he reported to the overseer at 4 He was personally led to the collection place by the overseer, Duncan, who also reminded him that he would be checking all night long and showed him where to sit and store the lantern. Duncan threatened, "If I catch you sleeping, you'll get the lash. The value of this turpentine cannot be lost or stolen." "Yes, sir," said Lazarus. "I'll keep good watch." Lazarus sat next to his lantern as the sun sank and darkness descended on the pine forest, supposedly keeping an eye on barrels of turpentine but mentally calculating distances and times. 3 miles west was Pharaoh's cabin. The supervisors typically showed up at dusk, which was now the case. They would socialize, play cards, and drink. They usually settled in for serious drinking 2 or 3 hours after arrival, based on his observations and what Silas had informed him. If his calculations were right, his clay pots would be ready for ignition between 8 and midnight. A large window, but one that should align with the supervisors being confined inside the locked cabin, comfy and intoxicated. Duncan conducted his first check at 8 a.m., emerging from the shadows to make sure Lazarus was conscious. "All quiet?" he inquired. Duncan gave an appraising grunt and vanished back into the forest. "Yes, sir. Nothing but crickets and owls." Lazarus believed he smelled smoke on the wind at 9:30, but he was unsure. There were always fires burning somewhere in the turpentine operation, and the night breeze was erratic. Controlled burning, processing facilities, and worker quarters. He stayed seated, appearing composed on the outside but tensed inside like a spring. Duncan came back for his second inspection at 10:15. He seems agitated this time. He said, "You smell smoke?" "Maybe a little," was Lazarus's cautious response. Duncan sniffed the air and said, "I thought it was just someone's cook fire. That's coming from the west. That's a lot of smoke for a cook fire." Lazarus stayed exactly where he was, his heart pounding, and he forced himself to remain calm, to give no sign of the chaos he knew must be unfolding 3 miles away. 20 minutes later, he saw the orange glow through the trees to the west, not the slight flickering of a light. He hesitated, uncertain. "You stay here. Don't move. I'm going to check what that is." Duncan vanished into the darkness, moving west toward the source of the smoke. When we thought we had seen it all, the horror in Cumberland County intensified. If this story is chilling you, share this video with a friend who enjoys dark mysteries. And don't forget to hit the like button to support our content. There was a roaring conflagration that lit up the night sky, casting dancing shadows through the forest. Other workers started to appear, drawn by the light and commotion. Someone was shouting in the distance, raising voices in alarm. "Pack up," Duncan said to Lazarus. "Night watch is over." An hour later, Duncan returned with 3 more guys, all of them covered in soot and reeking of smoke, their looks gloomy and shocked. Subscribe to never miss stories like these. Let's find out together what happens next. An unfortunate accident has occurred. What took place? Lazarus inquired, letting his voice contain just the proper amount of worry. Duncan replied in a hollow voice, "Pharaoh's cabin, reduced to ashes. Inside were the supervisors. There were all 9 of them." He was unable to complete the phrase. Lazarus maintained a neutral expression despite the cold satisfaction that descended upon him. Startled. "All 9, he said again. "How? I'm not sure yet. The fireplace must have been the source of the fire. Spread too quickly. The door was secured from the inside. The windows closed. It was too late by the time anyone noticed the flames. For all of them, it is too late." Lazarus could see the glow still burning in the distance as they made their way back toward the main facility. Everything had been consumed by the fire with an almost supernatural ferocity. Lazarus had taken into consideration the dry winter wood, the enclosed space, the vapor accumulation, and the numerous ignition points, even though he was fully aware of how natural and meticulously planned each component had been. He had set the stage for a conflagration from which 9 men would have no way out. Lazarus heard the astonished murmurs, the conjecture and the dread as word of the catastrophe spread across the workers' quarters. He was not suspected. Why would they? Throughout the evening, he was directly supervised from a distance of 3 miles, and his presence was verified by witnesses. Astonished by the horrific event that had killed 9 white men, he was just another slave. However, Lazarus did not feel victorious as he lay on his bunk that night, listening to the cries of men still fighting the ashes of the fire in the distance. 9 people had perished in the fire. Dina and their son had been exacted revenge on. The men who had institutionalized cruelty and theft had been punished, but his wife had not returned. What had been taken from him had not been returned. It had merely balanced an ash and blood ledger. When he closed his eyes, he saw Dina's face, recalled her laugh, felt her hands ghost in his, and experienced something for the first time since he found out about her fate. He cried, tears of relief, of a burden finally lifted, of a debt finally settled, not just tears of sorrow. At morning, the fire investigation got underway. Along with the plantation owners, including Cyrus Hartwell and a number of Faggotville officials, Vernon Ketchum arrived. It was a picture of complete destruction. The cabin of the Pharaoh had been reduced to a burning foundation of stone and burnt wood. The remains of the 9 bodies were hardly recognizable as human. The bones themselves had partially calcined, turning to ash and pieces due to the extreme heat. The first conclusion was clear-cut and quick. Terrible mishap. It was obvious that the fire had begun in or close to the fireplace, perhaps as a result of a spark starting the firewood stack that Silas and Lazarus had brought the previous day. From the inside, the door had been locked. When the fire started, the windows closed against the cold, forming a death trap. The men had consumed alcohol. Among the wreckage, empty whiskey bottles were discovered, which explained why they hadn't acted sooner to save themselves. "Terrible thing," Hartwell remarked as he stood next to the wreckage. "In one instant, 9 good men. The operation will be delayed by months as a result. However, The straightforward answer did not fully satisfy Vernon Ketchum. Something about the scene disturbed him because he was a meticulous man who had made his career out of paying attention to details. It had burned too quickly and too hot. The intensity implied accelerants even after taking into consideration the firewood and the wooden structure, and accelerants were always present in a turpentine operation. However, why would a supervisor's cabin contain concentrated turpentine? He strolled observing the burn's pattern along the ruin's perimeter. 3 areas appeared to have experienced the most extreme heat. Yes, close to the fireplace, but also in the center of the room and along the western side. There are 3 different maximum combustion points. For a fire that had allegedly spread from a single source, that was unusual. Ketchum called to the elderly guy who had assisted in delivering the firewood, Silas. "Yesterday, did you bring wood here?" "Indeed, sir. Lazarus and I stacked everything neatly, just as Mr. Farrow had requested." "Did that wood include anything else? Are there any containers?" "Any supplies?" Silas gave a headshake. "Only wood, sir. Split pine that is dry and delicious." Ketchum glanced to Lazarus, who was standing with a suitably solemn face amid the laborers. Lazarus looked straight into Ketchum's eyes, his face honest and open. "You helped with the wood?" "Yes, sir." "Did you notice anything unusual? Anything in the cabin that seemed out of place?" "No, sir, just the cabin, like always. Farrow, he kept an eye on us and ensured that the wood was stacked neatly. We followed instructions and departed." Ketchum looked at him for a while. The man's alibi was flawless, but there was something in his eyes, a depth and intelligence that seemed out of place with his status. Lazarus had been supervised at the collection point when the fire occurred, according to Duncan's confirmation. There was no way he could have been involved. "All right," said Ketchum. "At last, everyone, get back to work. Tragic or not, we have targets to reach." However, Ketchum's concerns prompted him to investigate the supervisor's affairs more thoroughly, even though he didn't act on them right away. He was really taken aback by what he found. The ledger was in the ruins of Farrow's cabin, safely stored in a metal box that had withstood the fire. The book was mostly undamaged, but the lock had melted. Its pages were still readable despite being burned at the edges. When Ketchum opened it, he discovered 7 years' worth of thorough records showing that the very plantation owners he worked for had engaged in systematic theft. Ketchum found himself in a precarious situation. The plantation owners would be aware that they had been robbed for years while he was in charge if he disclosed the ledger. They might suspect him of being involved in the scam and criticize him for not spotting it. He might be subject to legal repercussions and his reputation would be ruined. However, he would be upholding a lie and safeguarding the memory of 9 thieves if he destroyed or concealed the ledger. He didn't hesitate to make his choice. A week later, the ledger vanished, destroyed in a fire in his own office. He said that an overturned lantern was the cause of the accident. The extent of the theft was never disclosed to the plantation owners. Eventually, some disparities in the production records were discovered, but they were dismissed as regrettable but irreparable losses and ascribed to the deceased boss's bad bookkeeping. The official narrative was corrected. A terrible unintentional fire had claimed the lives of 9 supervisors, an awful reminder of the risks that come with working in the turpentine industry. In the nearby cemetery, they were laid to rest in a mass grave, their names written on a plain stone monument. They were praised as hard-working men who were tragically taken too soon at the funeral, which was attended by the county's white residents and plantation owners. No enslaved person showed up for the funeral, and those who did have suspicions about the truth about that fire kept them to themselves. The turpentine operation experienced changes in the weeks after the fire. Notable modifications. Men from other counties who had no ties to the former government were brought in as new supervisors. If anything, the plantation owners, who had grown anxious about oversight in the wake of the tragedy, kept a closer eye on these new men. Although there were more frequent inspections and direct accountability, the system of remote forest camps persisted. Lazarus's life resumed a routine that was both familiar and irrevocably changed. He met his quotas, worked the trees he was given, and made sure no one noticed him. Those who knew him well, however, noticed changes. He was more reserved and quieter than before. 9 lives had been lost in a burning cabin, along with the spark Dina had ignited in him. That fleeting moment of connection and hope. In May 1856, 3 months after the fire, Lazarus got some shocking news. His legal owner, Cyrus Hartwell, had made the decision to sell him to a plantation owner in eastern North Carolina. who was in need of skilled turpentine workers, not to the south as he had initially feared. The transaction was standard, unexceptional, and merely another exchange in the ceaseless purchasing and selling of people that defined the time period. However, an elderly woman named Hattie, who had initially informed Lazarus about Danina's attack, pulled him aside before he could leave Cumberland County. Although she never discussed it openly, she was among the few who appeared to comprehend the true nature of what had transpired that February night. She whispered, "I heard something," as her eyes locked with his. "I've heard that Dina works on a plantation that grows rice in the low country close to Charleston. The plantation belonged to a man named Rutledge. I don't know if it's true, but that's what I heard." Lazarus took in the information without showing any emotion, but something inside him changed. "Thank you," he said simply. Hattie nodded. Dina was alive. She was working in the far-off rice fields of South Carolina, where fatigue and malaria killed dozens of workers. She said carefully, "I don't know what happened in that fire. I don't want to know. But whatever debts you settled, I hope they gave you some peace." "Peace isn't what I found," Lazarus said, "but maybe it's what I paid for." The sale proceeded, and Lazarus was taken to his new home, a plantation close to Kinston. His new owner, a man named Peter Sonnen, wasn't especially cruel or kind. The work was similar to what Lazarus had done in Cumberland County, tapping pines and collecting resin. But the atmosphere was different. The supervisors were closely watched and regular oversight checked their authority. Lazarus worked at the Peter Sonnen plantation for 2 years, gathering as much information as he could about the route south, the plantation near Charleston where Danina might be, and the possibility, however remote, of somehow reaching her, even though he knew it was probably impossible because of the vast distance and the insurmountable obstacles. At first, Lazarus found little significance in the rumors that circulated among the enslaved workers in the fall of 1858 about tensions between the North and South, political crises over the expansion of slavery, and the possibility of war. The worries of politicians seemed so far removed from the everyday reality of survival in the turpentine forests. But older workers spoke of wars as times of chaos, when the normal order broke down, when impossible things sometimes became possible. However, knowing that she lived, that she was somewhere in the world, gave him something to cling to during the darkest moments. In October 1858, a remarkable event occurred when a man posing as a slave trader showed up at the Peter Sonnen plantation with documents allowing him to buy a number of workers for a buyer in South Carolina, including Lazarus. The price offered was generous, $120, more than Lazarus's likely market value, and Peter Sonnen, ever the profit seeker, accepted the sale. 2 days later, Lazarus was shackled in a wagon bound for the south, along with 3 other workers who had also been bought. As they made camp in a dense forest somewhere along the border between North Carolina and South Carolina on the 3rd night, the trader did something unexpected. He unlocked Lazarus's shackles. "You can run if you want," the trader said quietly, "or you can listen to what I have to say." The trader was a rugged-looking man who said little and drove the wagon with efficient determination. "You owe a debt now to the people who arranged this," Lazarus said, feeling his heart pound. "Who are you?" "Name isn't important. What's important is that an old woman named Hattie back in Cumberland County got word to certain people that you needed to get south, needed to find someone near Charleston. That's going to cost you, though. The sort you give back. A network exists. People are assisting others in finding their families and getting to their destinations. You locate the person you're seeking. You assist the next individual. It operates that way. It must operate that way." The merchant withdrew a fragment of, "I have to make this look real. But you're getting off this wagon come morning. There are people who will help you get closer to Charleston. This is the 3 that I purchased. They're going to be sold properly in Columbia, Rutledge Plantation outside Charleston. That's where she is, as far as anyone knows." Lazarus took the paper, his hand shaking slightly, and thought, "Why? Why would anyone do this?" Hattie had said that you had already paid a debt, so it was difficult to read the trader's expression in the firelight. But the last part, getting onto that plantation, finding her, that's on you. And if you're caught, you never heard of me. Never heard of this network. Understand? Don't waste it." The wagon stopped at a crossroads the following morning. The trader nodded toward a narrow path that led east. Follow that path 3 miles and you'll reach a farm. He said you paid it in full. He said you settled accounts for many people, even if they don't know it. The network that assisted Lazarus was a part of a larger, loosely organized system that had existed in the shadows of the South for decades. Ask for a woman named Grace. Tell her you're the one from Cumberland County. She'll know what to do. Lazarus climbed down from the wagon free of shackles for the first time in years, looked back at the traitor once, meeting his eyes in silent acknowledgement, then turned and walked down the path into an uncertain future. Grace, the woman at the farm, was a free black woman who had bought her own freedom 20 years earlier and now used her legitimate business selling produce to plantation kitchens as cover for helping people navigate the dangerous geography of the enslaved South. She hid Lazarus for 3 days while arrangements were made, then sent him on to the next link in the chain, a white farmer who opposed slavery on religious grounds. They all worked together to reunite families torn apart by the brutal economics of slavery. Operating on the principles of mutual aid and secrecy, each person knowing only their small part of the larger whole, shielding the others by purposeful ignorance of the entire network. The journey took almost a month, from which Lazarus passed through a number of way stations that brought him closer to Charleston, a month of hiding in barns and root cellars, a month of traveling at night, a month of adopting different identities and stories, a month of pretending to be a worker being moved between plantations as a slave, hired out for temporary labor, as whatever the circumstances demanded, a month of wearing clothes that fit his cover stories, a month of forged documents when necessary, and finally, when Lazarus arrived on the outskirts of Charleston in early December 1858, he discovered that the Rutland plantation, a rice plantation spanning thousands of acres of low-country marshland 10 miles outside the city, employed hired laborers during harvest season, bringing in additional labor from nearby areas. Lazarus spent a week observing the plantation from a distance, learning its rhythms, identifying potential approaches, and figuring out how to get on board while avoiding suspicion. He was able to join a group of these workers by posing as a hand sent from a nearby plantation to assist with the late harvest. On his 3rd day of work in the rice fields, he saw her while bending over in knee-deep water cutting rice stalks. Denina was carrying a bucket of water to the workers along the field's edge. She was thinner than he remembered, her face harder from years of hardship and grief, but it was definitely her, alive, moving through the world, existing in the same moment as him, their gazes locked across 50 feet of rice paddies. Lazarus met her halfway, and when they did, when his arms closed around her after 3 years apart, the weight of everything he had done, everything he had endured, everything he had paid to get to this point, finally made sense. For a frozen moment, neither moved, both locked in a moment of recognition so profound it seemed to stop time itself. Then Denina took a step toward him and another, moving faster until she was running, splashing through the shallow water, not caring who saw, not caring about the consequences. Other workers had paused to observe, some grinning, some sobbing, all realizing the miracle of 2 people finding each other across the vast, cruel distances of the enslaved South. "You found me," Denina whispered against his chest. 2 people who had been split apart by a system that was intended to deny their humanity, now reunited through a combination of planning, luck, and the hidden networks of resistance that slavery's brutality had ironically created. "How did you come across me?" In response, Lazarus said, "I never stopped looking." However, the reality of their situation overshadowed their reunion. Lazarus was there illegally under false pretenses and was unable to stay. They had only a few hours or perhaps a few days before his presence would raise suspicions, and someone would scrutinize his documentation more thoroughly before the lie was exposed. That night, they met in secret in the slave quarters and discussed their options in whispers. "I can't," Dina said. "Running is for the young and strong, and I'm neither anymore. If we're caught together, they'll kill us both." Lazarus told her about the network that had helped him, about the possibility of escape, and about reaching free territory in the north. "You've already paid too much, Lazarus. Don't pay more." "Then I'll stay here," Lazarus said. "I'll find a way to be sold here, to work here with you, and live your whole life in rice fields that'll kill you in 5 years. They argued through the night, each attempting to persuade the other to put survival before reunion. By daybreak, however, they had come to an agreement. During these few valuable days, they would have as much time as they could. Following that, Lazarus would travel north, pursue independence, and lead the life made possible by Dina's sacrifice. With her hand on his face, she said, "You live free. I must be free somewhere because you are free. You get it? I own your freedom. This must be that way. Lazarus stayed on the Rutland plantation for 5 more days. Years of grief and longing were condensed into brief moments during 5 days of discussions that were stolen. He informed Dinina about the 9 men, the fire, and the debt he had paid to make up for their mistreatment of her and their child. Instead of being startled or frightened as he had imagined, she merely nodded as though she had known all along, as though the knowledge of his retaliation had been inscribed in the smoke and ash that had spread for hundreds of miles. She said plainly they deserved it, and more. On the 6th day, Lazarus departed the plantation before daybreak. Alongside him, Dinina strolled to the edge of the rice fields, where the farmed area gave way to untamed marsh. After a final embrace, Lazarus turned north toward freedom and a future that would always be shaped by his past losses and his actions to exact revenge. Dinina was never seen by him again. What transpired with Lazarus after December 1858 is not well documented in history. There are possibilities, ideas, and clues, but no firm answers. According to some stories, a man who fit his description lived in Pennsylvania around 1859, working under a false identity in a lumber camp. According to some, he managed to reach Canada and settled in a neighborhood of former slaves close to Toronto. Others report that he perished while trying to enter a free area. His final fate is unclear and his body never retrieved. What is known is that on February 6, 1856, a fire in Cumberland County, North Carolina, which was officially declared accidental, claimed the lives of 9 men. The fact that they died put an end to a scheme of systematic cruelty and theft that had been going on for years under the guise of lawful business. There is no doubt that the fatalities were so flawlessly performed, so seemingly by chance that no one was ever prosecuted. There was never any evidence of murder. In the annals of North Carolina's turpentine industry, the fire was reduced to a footnote, an unfortunate reminder of the risks involved in handling combustible materials. Only a worn stone marker in a cemetery that few people visit anymore bears the names of the 9 supervisors, who were largely forgotten. However, as oral history was passed down through the decades, the tale of Lazarus and the fire that killed 9 men continued to be told among the descendants of enslaved people who labored in those pine forests. In these retellings, the tale evolved into a parable about the extent to which love and grief could push someone who had nothing left to lose, about debts that could only be settled by fire and ashes, and about justice that the legal system would never offer. If it was Lazarus's retaliation, the details of how he planned and carried it out, as well as the reality of what transpired, perished with him. However, the fire itself is still recorded in county records, plantation operations ledgers, and the death certificates of 9 men who perished in the same location on the same night, under circumstances that were just likely enough to be deemed accidental. The ledger Vernon Ketchum destroyed carried its secrets to the afterlife, and he never publicly discussed his suspicions about the fire. The extent of the theft was never disclosed to the robbed plantation owners, and the system that had made it possible, separated camps, unbridled power, and treating people like property, persisted until the Civil War ultimately destroyed the economic base upon which it all was built. An old Charleston woman was interviewed by a Northern writer covering the impact of slavery in the decades following the war, when former slaves started to share their memories more freely. Dinina, who went by her name, talked about her life prior to liberation, the struggles she had on rice plantations, and the husband she lost to North Carolina's turpentine forests. If she ever found out what happened to her husband, the reporter inquired. Lazarus is the name of this individual. Carefully, she said, I think he found his freedom. I think he found what he was seeking for one way or another. And I know enough about that. She gave a slight smile and shifted the topic when asked if her husband had actually escaped north or had met some other fate. Her expression seemed to convey that some stories were not intended to be told in their entirety, to be recorded in newspapers, or to be kept in archives. Some tales were intended to endure in rumors, in the gaps between recorded history, and in the recollections of those who recognized that justice and the law were not necessarily synonymous. Although the turpentine industry that formerly characterized Cumberland County has long since vanished from the landscape, the county's pine forests remain intact. The scars on old trees are still visible if you stroll through those forests now. Even though the box cuts from more than a century and a half ago have healed, They are still discernible as dark striations on weathered bark. The foundation stones of Pharaoh's cabin, which mark the location where 9 men perished in a fire that altered nothing and everything, are concealed beneath decades of forest growth if you know where to look. The faintest traces are often left by the most carefully concealed truths, as this mystery demonstrates. A ledger was destroyed, a name passed down through the generations, a love that forged a way across impossibly long distances despite loss and isolation. How do you feel about this tale? Do you think it was all revealed? Do you believe that Lazarus was genuinely liberated? Or did his retaliation cost him more than he could afford? Post a comment below. If you liked this story, subscribe, click the notification bell, and tell someone you love mysteries hidden in the shadows of American history if you want more horror stories like this. The past maintains its secrets well, but occasionally, if we pay close enough attention, we can hear the whispers of truth in the quiet. I'll see you in the following video.